Hello, everybody. Mr. Druid here. So, please, if you have not done so, please go over to my video that says what we covered in class today on 3/2/21. And in there, I gave some very important announcements and what we did in class today. So, in this video, I'm going to go over the Chapter 3 outline. So, in Chapter 2, we finished that and we talked about how we got rid of the Articles of Confederation, and now that we have a Constitution. So, what is the Constitution? Well, that's what Chapter 3 is going to discuss. So, in Section 1, it starts off by talking about what the Constitution is. So, the best way to look at the Constitution, it tells us our basic principles and our laws. It is an outline or a guide telling us what we can and cannot do. So, that's what the Constitution is. It's a basic outline, and it gives us a guide to look to of how we make laws and how we conduct ourselves as a society. In the Constitution, we can add amendments. We first started off with 10 amendments pretty much from the beginning, only about 3 to 4 years after the Constitution was finally ratified or approved. We added the 10 amendments. And then today, we have only added 27 amendments altogether. Although that may seem like a lot, that really is not. To add 27 amendments only since 1789 is very impressive because we're over 250 years old. And so having a amendment, 27 amendments or 27 changes to the Constitution is pretty impressive. So just keep that in mind that it's not easy to change the Constitution. And we're going to discuss in a little bit why that's so. There are 7 articles to the Constitution. And in Article 6, VI, for those that don't know, is 6. The Constitution is the law of the land. That's what it says. So that means that no other law, no other document is above the Constitution. We look to the Constitution for everything. So if we have questions about, is that legal for the entire country? We'd look to the Constitution because it is what guides us. Again, it's our guide. So in Article 6, it says this is the main law. No other law trumps it. In the Constitution, we have 6 main principles you need to know. And Miss Lucas made a cool little visual for you that you can get outside of door 30. And we have a bunch of stuff you can grab, outlines and visuals and cool little hands-on things if you want them. All these resources are online, but if you want a hand copy outside of door 30 near the tennis courts. But in there, we have this cool little graphic organizer that tells you the 6 principles. So I'm going to go through each principle right now. The first one is popular sovereignty. This is the idea that we, the people, hold the power. We give the government their power. We can give them their power. We can take it away from them. So popular sovereignty, that idea that we, the people, control them, not the government, us, the citizens. So that's the first one. The second principle is limited government. Our founding fathers were so afraid of people getting way too much power, so they said there needs to be limited government. Tying into popular sovereignty, the people decide how much power the government gets. It has to be authorized by the people. And the idea is that the government is not above the law. They have to follow the same rules. They have to follow what we follow. And this is supposed to make sure the government doesn't get too big for their britches. They have to follow the rule of law. So our government has to be limited. This means the federal government, even though they have more power, they need to be limited in their power. And it's us, the people, have to keep track of that. So that's the second principle. The third principle is the separation of powers. In the separation of powers, each branch gets their own jobs. They get their own duties. And the other branches cannot touch those jobs and duties. Our founding fathers made sure that each branch was given different powers and that no other branch can touch those powers because, again, they did not want our government getting too powerful. They didn't want one person or one group to get too much power. So we separated it into three branches: the executive, the legislative, and the judicial. And on that sheet Miss Lucas has with the visuals, there's a nice little picture of a tree that shows you the different branches. And so an example of a power that is only given to one branch would be Congress. Congress is the only ones that can make laws. The executive, so the president can't, and the Supreme Court, which is the judicial, they cannot. Only Congress, the legislative branch, can make laws. This is the same for the executive and the judicial. They have powers that the Congress can't touch. Now, each branch gets their own power. So that was the third one. This is the third principle. But the fourth principle goes hand in hand with it, is checks and balances. A check, for those that want to know, is not what, yes, it is what you get paid with at the end of the week when you work, but it also means that it's a correction. It is making sure that they're following the rules. So if I check someone's language, if someone says a swear word in class and I check them, I say, no, language, you don't use that, I would be making sure that they're following the rules. They are not breaking the rule of not cursing in school. So this is the same in the government. The individual branches, so the executive, the legislative, and the judicial, they check each other. They make sure that they're staying in their lane, making sure that they're not breaking the rules. So this was put in place so that they wouldn't get too powerful. So because they check each other, it creates balance because no one branch will get too powerful because the other two branches will say, no, you can't do that. An example of this is that the president cannot make the laws. Only Congress can do that. We learned that up here. But the president must approve or ratify all laws passed. The president can approve it or he can not approve it. If he doesn't ratify it and he doesn't sign his name on it, it is what we call a veto. That means he denies it. So a veto is the president's way of checking Congress to make sure laws are not getting it too powerful or Congress isn't getting too powerful. So that's a good example. However, Congress has a check on the president. Let's say there's a law that Congress really, really wants passed, and they disagree with what the president says. Well, Congress can overrule them. If you get, and I'm going to type it in here, a 2/3 majority in Congress, a veto, a presidential veto, can be overrode. That means it would be passed. And this doesn't happen often since you need 2/3 of Congress. And I'm not a mathematician, but there's 535 members of Congress. So that means over 280 Congress people have to agree on it in order for a presidential veto to be overrode. So there's a few examples of this, but the most recent was actually with President Trump. President Trump, in the last few weeks of his presidency, he vetoed a budget bill that Congress gave him. So they said, okay, this is the budget. We want to make sure that we get money to pay for services and variety of things. And Congress agreed on a budget, and it was sent to President Trump. His job was to sign it or to veto it. He vetoed it, which was 100% legal. The president was allowed to veto it. However, He vetoed it, but his reasoning for vetoing it is what made Congress angry. Congress was mad because Trump didn't veto the bill because of the money being spent or how much money was being used or given away. It was vetoed because it didn't have a provision on something about social media. There was something to do with social media, something to do about the internet, and they were upset with that because there was no reason in the people in Congress's mind for that to be in a budget bill. And this is actually something the Democrats and the Republicans, yes, the Republicans as well, the ones Trump's own party, uh, thought was weird, and they didn't agree on the president. They thought it was not meant to be in a budget bill. So what they did is that they said, you know what, we disagree with you. They got the necessary 2/3 majority. You need to have at least 2/3. You can have more than this, but you can't have under this. So 2/3 of Congress actually agreed, and they overrode his veto. So it doesn't happen often, but when it does, it's because there's a reason that Congress believes that was necessary. So this is the fourth principle, checks and balances. The fifth principle is judicial review. This is when the courts, and specifically the Supreme Court, decides whether an act is constitutional, meaning it follows the Constitution and that it's okay and that it's legal, or it's unconstitutional, that it doesn't follow the Constitution and it's illegal and it shouldn't, has to be thrown away because it's not legal. This process is called judicial review, and it's used a lot. You'll see it in the news with court cases all the time, and we'll learn later on in this class different court cases that were both considered constitutional and unconstitutional. But this is a major power for the courts, the Supreme Court, and this is their major check on the other branches. So there's the fifth principle. And the sixth and final principle is federalism. We've talked about federalism, and in that cool little graphic that you can get outside door 30, and we showed it in chapter 1 where the boxes were big and small, and it talked about unitary, confederate, and federal systems. Well, federalism is the one that was in the middle, and it showed that the federal government, the central government, shares power with the state or local governments. So they're more equal, where the federal has a little bit more power, but the states still have a lot of power. So federalism is the final part of that of the principles of the six. So popular sovereignty, limited government, separation of powers, checks and balances, judicial review, and federalism are the six main principles of our Constitution. And a nice little hint, that'll be on the test. So I recommend getting that cool little graphic organizer Miss Lucas has outside of door 30. In section 2, we talk about the formal amendment process. There are multiple ways we can amend the Constitution, and none of them are easy. On page 79, and I'm going to put that right here, page 79 in your textbook, there is a cool little visual that can tell you the different ways our Constitution can be amended. But the part that we're talking about right here is the most common. So the most common is that it's introduced at a national level, so it's introduced at the federal government, and it is brought through Congress. Congress looks at it, they want to make a change to the Constitution, and they have to approve it by 2/3 majority. That 2/3 majority again. That means over 280 Congress people have to agree, which is very difficult, in order for the process to move forward. So, but let's say they do. They say they want to make let's say, a minimum wage law. They want to make it official in the Constitution as an amendment. They would have to say, okay, we agree on $12 an hour is the new minimum wage. So 2/3 of Congress would have to agree. Once they agree and it gets approved, it then goes to the states. Because we're a federal system, the states have a say because we are a federal system. And three-fourths of the state legislators must ratify or approve it. That means 75% of the states have to approve the amendment that they brought forth in Congress, that same amendment. They have to approve the exact same amendment by 75% of all the states, which is very difficult. 75% of states can barely agree on anything ever. And has it happened? Of course it has. It happened 27 times. We've had 27 amendments, so this has happened around 27 times that the states had to agree. But the amendment process isn't easy because 75% is very difficult. So again, there's more processes. There's other ways this can get amended, and I shouldn't have said 27. All of them were this way, but most of them were. I'd say over 90% of them were in this process right here. So that's just one, but we'll discuss more about formal amendment processes in our additional notes, and you'll read in your readings. So we've already discussed how there's 27 amendments and how it's very difficult to get this through this process. The first 10 of them were the Bill of Rights, and that came in 1791. That was like right out the gate. We got this Bill of Rights. And the Bill of Rights, and we'll learn more about this on Wednesday when we go have our constitutional scavenger hunt. We'll learn more about the 10 amendments, which is like our right to free speech, right to bear arms, right to a lawyer. The 22nd Amendment is an amendment that got passed that limits the president's term. So he can only have 2 terms in office because of the 22nd Amendment. Before this, it was just tradition that we would just have no third term. So we would just have 2 terms. And from George Washington all the way up until Hoover, they followed this tradition. However, FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, he came in and he said, wait a minute, there's no rule saying I can't run for a third term. So he did. 100% legal. He did it. It wasn't against the rules. He just broke tradition. So he became president and he won a third term. And he didn't stop there. He actually went for a 4th term and he won again. So he served 3 full terms and then he died in his 4th. So he got elected 4 times, which the people loved him. He was elected 4 times. But after his death, Congress came together and they said, wait a minute, do we want that power to be in the hands of one person? No. So they made the 22nd Amendment to limit the power, and the states agreed. And so now the president can only serve 2 terms. The 27th Amendment, which is about congressional pay, how much money Congress gets paid and how they do it, was first mentioned in 1789, like right when our document was being formed, the Constitution. But it was kind of put on the back burner and it wasn't ratified or approved until 1992. So that means that even though if it's an old idea, it could still come back and become law. So it was only 1992 since our last amendment, which may seem like a long time, but it is a long time. But again, we've only changed it 27 times, so not shocking. So there's some clarifications that we want to give you, that each branch has their own influence on the Constitution in their own way. Each branch. Congress has their main influence by their laws that they pass. Congress can help shape the way we look at the Constitution or how it's viewed just by the laws that they pass. And if it's not disputed, it's pretty much just assumed, oh, it's following the Constitution. Or if they make it a law and it isn't what people think, it gets contested and the courts look at it and it's seen as constitutional or unconstitutional. So, but laws have helped shape the way we look at the Constitution. The president has brought forth change by making executive agreements with foreign leaders, making foreign relations, the way we interact with other nations and other people. The president has huge influence. The president's influence is what has helped shape the Constitution. The president is seen as our leader. He's seen as our example. And because of this, that is how people go, oh, the president's doing it. The president's okay. He's making agreements with other countries and he's doing all these cool and interesting things. It must be constitutional. But it's also things that the president has done that people disagree with. And they say, is that even constitutional? And that has happened. So the president, through his influence, has helped shape the Constitution. And then finally, the courts, the Supreme Court, gets to interpret and apply the Constitution by hearing court cases and hearing cases in general that says, oh, that's constitutional or that's unconstitutional. I'm sorry for that. My dog is running around. I'm sorry about that. So now we're going to talk about party practices. Many of the framers, or if we say framers, when they say framers, they're talking about the people that framed the Constitution, or we could just call them founding fathers. They did not like political parties. They hated political parties. They thought that they were evil. They thought they were bad. President Washington really despised them. He thought that they would destroy this country. But we ended up with them. What's even more ironic is that even though they hated them, our founding fathers were the first ones to actually create political parties in this country. With Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton, they created the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists, and that became our first party. And then it has evolved, and we've eventually now have the Republicans and the Democrats. So parties have influenced the way we look or how Constitution has run or how it's changed in a few ways. But the most probably noticeable is how the president and vice president, how they're elected. Back in the day, when there was a presidential election, when a president was elected, okay, the person won. The vice president was the runner-up. That means, let's say in today's context, that means in the latest election that we just had, that means we would have President Joe Biden and Vice President Donald Trump if we kept the old system. However, that didn't really work out. It happened for the first three presidents. So George Washington, John Adams, then the problem arose with Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson's had some issues with his vice president, which was Aaron Burr. I'm not going to go into it too deeply because this isn't history, but there were some disputes, there were some arguments, and eventually, after that whole election, change started to be pushed forth, and eventually, thanks to political parties, the president would no longer have the runner-up be their vice president. They would just run with a vice president. They get to choose their vice president, and the president and vice president get elected together. So that is one way political parties have helped shape the Constitution. Now, not everything that we do in our government is based in words in the Constitution. The Constitution doesn't mention anything about a cabinet. The president has a cabinet. It's not what he gets his snacks from, it's his group of advisors. His advisors are people, what we call our Secretary of State, Secretary of the Treasury, Secretary of Defense. And the president gets to choose his advisors, and they're approved by Congress, but he gets to have his little advisors and that tell him what he can and cannot do. This has come through tradition. There's a few of these traditions, and there are certain customs that, even though they're not part of the Constitution, they're just seen as ceremonial, or they're seen as, oh, this is what happened. Now, we already discussed how there was a no third term tradition where the presidents all just said, oh, I'm just going to follow the 2-year, not 2-year, 2-term tradition that President Washington did. He only served for 2 terms. And every president after them says, I'm only going to run for 2 terms. And then no one actually went for a 3rd term except for FDR. FDR says, there's nothing saying I can't, so I'm gonna become president a 3rd time. And he did. He got elected. Then he said, I'm going to go for a 4th time. And he got elected. So he was the first and only president to ever break that term. All right. So that's it for our notes. And I know, our outline, I should say. I know this was a long video. And so I'm going to end it now. If you have any questions, please let me know. Send me a message. Please watch that previous video for any important information. And I will hope to see all of you in class. Thank you and have a wonderful day.